This is the American Veteran Show.
Proud to finally say these two words, welcome home.
Dedicated to those who have worn the uniform.
Tremendous national asset.
Dedicated to our active duty men and women.
They came not as conquerors, but as liberators.
Dedicated to presenting issues, topics, and interviews highlighting their commitment to our country.
I want to thank the courageous men and women who've served their country in uniform.
Less than 1% of the population of our country chooses to serve our country in the military. And the other 99% of us, we owe them.
Online at AmericanVeteranShow.com. Here's Steffan Tubbs.
Welcome to this week's edition of the American Veteran Show. So thankful for your time on this Sunday afternoon. We've got a real treat for you for the next hour, and a family is joining us that just means so much to me. And I was even saying before we started to do the program, it comes up next year, our 30th anniversary. 30 years I've known this Colorado family, and with connections. It's a big family, so they're all over the country. But if you are a member of the Cangilla family, welcome here on the American Veteran Show. We couldn't do programs like this without our presenting sponsor, Attorney John Boesen at Boesen Law, Boesen, BoesenLaw.com. Fighting on behalf of veterans every single day. Their number, 303-999-9999. This show dedicated to a World War II veteran, Lou Cangilla, and their sons, Ken and Chris, and Pat, their mother, is here with us. I want to start out by giving you an audio sample of what Ken and Chris have put together over the last few months, and it's called Our World War II Dad.
I'm Chris Cangilla alongside my brother Ken Cangilla, and we created this podcast to share some stories about our father, Army Private First Class Louis Cangilla, who served in the European theater during World War II. Now, Ken, you're going to have to act like our expert here. I know you are. Because on this podcast, we need some guidance. And over the past few years, I know you've been doing a lot of research about Dad's time overseas. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have really kind of immersed myself in it as I've gotten older. I very much wanted to understand what he went through.
The voices you heard, Ken and Chris Cangilla, they're just dear friends of mine. I don't have a brother, don't have a big family, so I kind of like inserted myself. First here in studio, welcome to Ken. It's great to see you, my man.
It's great to see you again, too. It's been a while.
Thank you. It has been. And then joining us via Zoom is Ken's brother, Chris. Chris, it's great to have you, man, and thank you for welcoming me almost 30 years ago into your family.
Steffan, you were a great addition to our clan, so thanks for joining us.
You bet. And the matriarch, Pat, it's so great to see you, you beautiful, loving woman, you.
You're just one of my boys, Steph.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to start with you, Pat. How did you meet Lou?
He worked down in the produce yards for a competitor of my father's, and I worked for my father. So that's how we met down there.
Was it love at first sight? Was it, I don't know if I want to even speak to this man? What was that like?
Well, he was a lot older than I am, and he was hesitant to date me, but he had such beautiful blue eyes. I just fell for them.
Mm. You meet him, at what point in his life and yours? What year are we talking about?
Well, I was just a year out of high school. He had finished high school. He had gone into the service for a couple of years. Then he went to college, but he did college in 2.5 years. He took a heavy load. And so he was working then. So he graduated from that college in 47, and I graduated from high school in 49.
Did he ever talk about what happened with him, his service in World War II with you?
Very, very little. The guys that he hung up with all served in different areas. They never talked about it.
Chris, is that one of the reasons why you decided to put this video and audio podcast series together called Our World War II Dad?
You know, Steph, it really is, because we didn't know much. You know, we got some of the stories, of course. You told Mom some things, and then Ken did some research about the other things that he discovered. And what was the precipice of us doing this podcast, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, a little bit later, is that, Ken retraced Dad's steps and went to Europe and found all those spots that he learned about. And I used to kid him, like, Ken, when you get home, I want to see, you got to do a PowerPoint presentation for me.
For the entire family, right? Right.
And I decided maybe we should just do a video podcast.
Yeah, Chris is a wonderful videographer and editor. And as I mentioned at the top, I came to know this family. We played in the Media Softball League. Chris was at a Denver television station. I was at another radio station. And, we just, you just, when you meet good people, you just know, because they're few and far between. Even back in the 1990s, you retrace, Ken, your dad's steps. What was that like?
Oh, it was just wonderful. He died in 1997, and I was in my 30s, and I was a dad. I was busy. I didn't really get the time to sit down and, talk one-on-one to a great degree with him. And he didn't talk about the war much anyway. He told snippets here and there. So I missed that window of opportunity when he was still alive. And it was some years after his death, I started going through his credenza in his office. And I just found this treasure trove of memorabilia that set me on this path. And one of the most unique things was this prayer card he had kept from 1945. It had a calendar on the back of it. And on the prayer card, he had put little tick marks on certain dates. And I said to Mom, I showed him to Mom, I said, do these tick marks mean anything? She goes, no. She goes, but he circled his birthday. And I go, well, I can recognize that.
Right.
So I started digging into the research about the troop movements for the 99th Infantry Battalion separate, which is what he was in. And each one of those tick marks denoted where the troops moved. So they weren't allowed to, keep journals and stuff in case they got captured. And even letters home were edited. So I took that prayer card and I started to piece his journey together, and come full circle, I was able to travel to Germany and Belgium and walk in his footsteps just this spring.
Wow. Ken Cangilla, Chris Cangilla, Pat Cangilla, two sons and a mom, talking about their late father and late husband, Lou Cangilla. I remember your dad, when we were playing softball, he would show up at times. I remember there was one, Chris, you'd remember better than me, just as an ancillary kind of sidebar story. There was somebody yelled some profanity at one point. One of you Cangilla boys were like, oh my God. Do you remember that?
Of course. Yeah. So another guy on the team got into a little scuffle with the other team and had some choice words for him. But, Dad really couldn't hear that from the stand. So when we came over after the timeout in the field, Dad went over to that person and asked, what'd he say? And he told him exactly the curse words that he said. And every one of my brothers, and probably even you, Steph, were like, oh, my goodness.
I know. I can't believe he just said that. He just said that to him, yeah.
Dad he ate it up. Dad loved it. I'm like, oh, my goodness, he would have killed one of us if we said that.
Yeah. Pat, do you remember, when Ken is doing the kind of the search through or the discovery of the credenza, I mean, you have to be even surprised.
Well, what we did is we'd sit down on the floor in the office, and Ken would hand me a paper. What's this, Mom? What does this mean? What date is this? Do you remember this? What picture is this? We had a wonderful time doing that.
Was it kind of, going down memory lane?
Oh, my, it was wonderful, yes.
Yeah.
And he had pictures of his old group that he went to high school with, and then some of them went to the same college as he did, Duquesne. And I was able to remember those and tell Kenny who they were.
Was it a little bit for you being able to, with Ken's research and what Chris has done as well in putting this together, Our World War II Dad? And friends, we will definitely get you all the information on how you can take part and watch this. I've loved every episode that I've seen. Were you able, Pat, to put two and two together, like, oh, this makes sense now? Or did you kind of feel like you knew all of this already?
Well, I didn't know all that. I remember we would watch TV, Dad and I. Mm-hmm. And he would see something on the news about a certain place in Europe. And he would say, oh, I was there. And if you go up this street or you go over there and the church is over here, he would remember all those things. And it was just so interesting. I wish he and I had gone to Europe together. Mm-hmm. It would have been wonderful.
Ken, are you surprised that he had those? I mean, to me, dealing with veterans for, 3 decades or so, 2+ decades at least, those memories, those are seared.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the things he would talk about, what would stick in his mind. And I think he purposely told World War II stories that were on the lighter side to protect the family, what he had seen.
Maybe his own heart.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so, but his recollection of even those lighter side moments, like him talking about just being amazed how the sun is still shining at 1:00 in the morning when he was up in Norway towards the end of the war. And just those little things like that were just really precious to hear. here. So he had a great memory, and if he'd have been here and I had sat down with him with what I know now, he would have filled in the blanks to perfection, and it would have been just an amazing story to hear from him.
Ken, Pat, and Chris Cangilla, they are our guests for this edition of the American Veteran Show. We'll take our first time out, and when we come back, more on the series, Our World War II Dad. Glad you're with us. We're just getting started. This is the American Veteran Show, AmericanVeteranShow.com.
This is the American Veteran Show, online at AmericanVeteranShow.com. Here's Steffan Tubbs.
Welcome back to the program. It is such a special edition, and I'm not trying to insert myself into this, but just loving this family, the Cangilla family. Next year will be 30 years that they kind of took me in, and here I'm a guy that just moved from California, and I'm in the media, and my friend Chris, who's joining us via Zoom on this episode. It's a friendship and a bond, and it doesn't matter how many years. And Ken, I think you would agree. I mean, I probably haven't seen you, I don't know how long. I mean, I follow you on social media, but it's like, I just feel like with you, I can just pick it right back up.
Yeah, it's probably the last softball game we played in together was the last time I saw you. And of course, I followed you on social media, and your quick trips to London and back were always amazing to me that somebody would jump on a plane and do that. So
somebody's got to do it.
Right.
Somebody's got to do it.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And your wonderful mother, you have just Pat Cangilla, you have always been so sweet to me for like almost 3 decades. And Chris said that I could say this, that he said that you said that it was okay. You are such a beautiful woman, and you are 91 years young as you sit here. And Ken, back me on this. She's your mom, but I mean, she does not look 91.
No, born in 1931. And if you looked at her, you'd say no way.
Does it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, hopefully someday Ken, myself, Chris will be 91. But does it seem? I mean, what a lifetime! That's almost a century of life experience. It's gotta. I don't know if you pinch yourself sometimes.
It's just amazing. In my family, if you wait until January, there will be 60 of us, with the grandchildren and the great grandchildren.
60.
60.
How many children did you have?
8.
And, toward the end of the broadcast today, I want to officially, on the American Veteran Show, thank you, Ken, thank you, Pat, and thank you, Chris, because without your family, I don't meet a man named Bob McAdam and do what I feel is I don't know if I could ever have maybe down the road. I don't think I'll ever top our documentary film 25 Steps on Bob McAdam, the POW from World War II, along with his amazing, roommate almost, certainly out in Highlands Ranch at a retirement home, Butch Desson. So I'll thank you guys at the end of the program for that. Chris, I want to, just in case people are just kind of picking up, we're here visiting. It's not just to reminisce of 30 years of friendship. It's to talk about, this idea that even Ken says, this was your idea, a video and audio podcast, Our World War II Dad. So take me through the steps. What clicks in you to go, I know video, you've known video all your career, but this is something special. 2 sons recalling what their dad did.
Yeah, it was really special, and I'm glad I had the idea. I haven't done a podcast before. I started working on another gentleman's podcast earlier in the year, and kind of got used to how that's done and figured out how to put that together because I was doing all the production for it. And literally it was, Steffan, I was texting with Ken when he was in Europe. He was sending me photos of all these places he was visiting where Dad might have been, Dad probably was. And I just was loving it. And he was telling the stories. I'm like, I really want you to do a PowerPoint presentation. And he laughed at me. And then I'm driving to work one day. And I'm like, well, I've been doing this podcasting thing. Mm-hmm. I can see how this would work. A video podcast where, I've been in this business. I can kind of take him through it. I'm not as good at the interview part as you are, but I can take him through and kind of guide him through the places we want to go and just kind of wind him up and let him tell the stories. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, from this side of it, my brother has taken on this storytelling aspect.
Right.
He has this great TV thing. And then we had Mom on one of the podcasts.
Yep. You did great, Pat.
I asked Mom a question. She answers it, and then she tosses to Ken for another response. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's a round table. She's doing great.
I'm telling you, Netflix, and eat your heart out. This is something that, and here's the other thing. This is not to take anything away from Lou at all. But Lou would be the first to tell you, he was just doing his job. He was just one man in a United States effort in World War II. And you think about what I love about what you guys have done, and rest in peace, your father, that he's not, at least in this earthly presence, able to see this. But how many, this potentially could play out millions of times over the decades. And I'm so glad you guys did it. When he presented the idea, Ken, did you? Because you're great. I mean, Chris kind of acts like the host, and you're the subject matter expert. I mean, Chris, he's using visuals and everything. I mean, it's just great.
He has callbacks. I mean, all these things that took me 30 years to gain, he got in a year.
Not
even a year, 3 months.
Yeah. But that had to be so cool to kind of do.
He did tease me about, doing the PowerPoint thing. And I'm like, yeah, right. And who wants to hear about your trip, And he just kept after me. He's like, no. He goes, we're doing a podcast. I go, are you sure? I go, I got great pictures and I got some great stories, but I don't know who's going to be interested. He goes, no, we're doing this. And as we unwrapped the whole thing, it just became really this kind of story that got its own momentum. And Chris and I both got into it from the standpoint of what was Dad thinking at 17, 18, 19 when, he enlisted and then he went through training and then he shipped off as a replacement. What was going through his head based on the things he had brought home? He brought home a Nazi flag he confiscated. He was given an Italian Beretta pistol by a crown prince in Austria because he helped him out when some displaced persons were rioting in his front yard. And so he brought these little tidbits back that as we unwrapped it, it really became an interesting story. And as Chris has said in the past, it's just truly an American story.
Mm-hmm. Chris and Ken and Pat Cangilla here for the program on the American Veteran Show as we talk about their video and audio series, Our World War II Dad. Chris, I don't want to wait till the very end, so let's do it now about midway through the program. How can people see this? And then after you kind of give it multiple times, I want to know the reaction so far that you've received.
Absolutely. And thank you very much because, we're very proud of it. It's not just our story. We talk a lot about Dad, but we talk about a lot of these other servicemen and the things that happened to them in these same areas. So I think people that love history, love learning about World War II dads and, World War II uncles and grandpas and even some of the World War II moms that were over there, serving with the WWII. Yeah. It's an American story, like Ken said. And so for us, it's on YouTube. And it is Our World War II Dad, and the WW2 is actually a WWII, capital II. So Our World War II Dad, it's on YouTube. But you also can find it on the audio versions on Apple and Spotify podcasts. But I recommend the YouTube version because you get to see all those visuals. And to answer your other question about the reaction, we have been very pleasantly surprised. People have reached out and said that they have, those dads or grandfathers, and they've kept the photos, and we really want them to send us their stories because, we kind of wrapped up the limited series podcast talking about Dad, but we're going to do another one where we can talk about a lot of these other fathers and a lot of the other places that Ken got a chance to visit that Dad wasn't at and continue the story there. So, yeah, it's been great.
One thing I like a lot, in fact, I love a lot, Ken, is that in doing this for your own family's purposes and, just having it kind of archived. I mean, your mom mentioned, you got 6 dozen family members, right? From grandkids, great grandkids, cousins, uncles, aunts, all of that. But when I first watched the first couple of episodes, I'm like, if they can inspire others to not even maybe go as far as you guys did, but just to have conversations around the kitchen table, I think that would be so great. I look at this as an inspirational project as well.
Yeah. And Chris and I talked about that. We said, we want it to be interesting and we want good visuals and everything. But the bottom line is we want to record this history. While we've got our 91-year-old mother with a sharp brain telling us what she knows, we want to record this for all the next generations. And I became a grandfather this year, and I am so excited that I've got this granddaughter who is going to get to hear about, great-great-grandpa Lou and great-grandma Pat and what their lives were like during a pivotal point in America, that they were the greatest generation. And I think doing this podcast just demonstrates that.
Yeah. Pat, before we go to our next break, what do you think of the series so far?
Well, I cried. I laughed. I enjoyed every minute of it. The boys did a wonderful job. It's just amazing. And you were talking about the other soldiers and things. Ken tells a story about talking about to Dr. Bob McAdam. And he questioned Kenny, why do you want to know all these things? everybody wants to know them because they lived it. We want to know about it.
And it is our duty to never, ever, ever forget. We'll continue our wonderful episode of the American Veteran Show with the Cangilla family. Again, the series, Our World War II Dad. Stay with us. When we come back, I want to know from each of our guests, who was Lou Cangilla? We'll have that next. This is the American Veteran Show, AmericanVeteranShow.com.
Welcome back to the American Veteran Show. We continue now with Steffan Tubbs.
We're just about midway through this week's edition of the American Veteran Show, and it is just my honor to have my longtime friends, the Cangilla family, Ken and Chris and Pat Cangilla. Pat, the matriarch of the family, 91 years young. Ken is here. He's a little younger than that, and Chris is joining us via Zoom. And Chris and I met back in 1994 when Chris was working in Denver media. I was just starting out, and I meet this family. I remember, for those of you listening in the Denver metro area, if I recall correctly, Chris, at a very young age, had just purchased a home. And I'm like, God, I hope in the next year I can purchase my first home. And Chris tells me, he says, you should come down sometime to my home. I live in this place called Highlands Ranch. And I had never, ever heard. I don't know if you remember that, brother, but that was as the kids say, I think, a hot minute ago. But yeah, I mean, that was 1994.
Yeah, I didn't know that you've never been there before, and I kind of introduced you to that area.
You did, and then I would live there for almost two decades, so I owe it all to you. I want to know, I want to start with you, Chris.
Okay.
As we talk about your video and audio podcast series, Our World War II Dad, as Chris mentioned, you can hear the audio on Apple iTunes and go to YouTube and see this limited series that I hope expands in ways, shapes, and forms. But who was Lou Cangilla? Who was your dad?
Well, of course, I can only speak to what I know of him, and how my, relationship was with him and what I've learned through this podcast. But, Dad was a little tougher than most, not extremely warm, very generous, loving, but not extremely warm. And I think that might have something to do with maybe how he was raised. And of course, going to war when you're 17 can do a lot to a person. So, yeah, he was a little, less warm than fathers of today. And he had me when he was 42. So, I'm the last of the 8 children. Mm-hmm. And I can only imagine, I'm a father myself. And it's funny when we're talking about Dad going away at 17, my children are older than 17 now. It's crazy. And so, talking about Dad and learning about him, I'm sure, at 42, he has me. He's had 8 kids. He was good on being a dad by then. So, I played a big part in his life, and of course he did in mine. But he was doing other things, and he worked a lot too. So, it was a good relationship, but just a little different than most of today.
Ken, where were you on the flow chart of 8 kids?
I was 5th born, so I'm pretty much in the middle.
And what was he like for you?
When I think about Dad, and if you had asked me this before I'd done the podcast, I would have just answered what he was like as an adult. But now I see him as really, more than one type of person. I see this younger version of him where he ships off to Camp Croft to be trained. He doesn't even know he's a replacement, so he doesn't even know what unit he's going with. And he's this 5'6". What did he weigh, Chris? 138 pounds or something?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Just this short guy, and he's I'm sure he's scared, never got outside of Pittsburgh very much, ships across the Atlantic, when he's 18, afraid to death he's going to get torpedoed as he goes across because his ship started to break down and fell behind the convoy. So I picture him as the scared kid. And then as we get towards the end of his military 2 years during World War II, you can see in the photos he's a changed man. He looks stronger. He looks tougher. He's got this confidence that you didn't see in those earlier pictures of him. So I see him that way. And then, Chris talks about him being a strict disciplinarian, but I see these old pictures of him on New Year's Eve, 1947, and he's, I don't know where he is, some apartment, somebody's house, and they're having a good time. And he's dressed to the nines in this suit. They look like the Rat Pack hanging out, and he's got a beverage in his hand of some kind, and he's having a good time. And I think, man, I'd like to sit down with that guy and have a beer with him because he'd be a really interesting guy to talk to. But then, as Chris said, he was a strict disciplinarian, worked his tail off for all of us to raise 8 kids, put a roof over our head. So we didn't get as much of his time as we did our dear mother. But I knew he loved me. I always knew he did. And, there was a time in my life when I was feeling pretty down. He never would say, I love you, but he'd bring you Italian sausage and make sure you had Italian sausage in the refrigerator.
And that was kind of translation, right?
Absolutely.
Pat, the man that you fell in love with and married and had a huge family with, huge being my editorial comment, because I only have one sibling. How do you describe Lou?
Well, when we were first dating, he ran around with a big crowd of young men, and they were just the best, just really good. They went to Sacred Heart grade school together, went to Central High School together, and then they all went off in different areas. But then they came back and they hung out together, and we just loved each other. And I thought, if that man has that many friends, he's got to be a good man. Mm-hmm. That was one of the reasons why I married him.
Mm-hmm. Did you know you were going to have a large family? Did you come from a large family, or did he?
Yes, he had 7 and we had 6 in my family. And I wanted a large family. Mm-hmm. Didn't know I was going to have them so close together. Mm-hmm. Some of them are only 15 months apart. But they came fast. And the thing was, like Ken said, Lou was busy all the time, didn't have enough time to spend with the kids. Then the grandkids came. Oh, my gosh. They were so special. I said, you love those grandkids more than you do your own kids. He says, yep. He says, they go home.
Steffan, if I could,
please.
I'd like to tell a short little story about Dad in his later years and him showing love for us. He wasn't in the best of health towards the end of his life. And, of course, you were on this team. I was managing this media softball team. And you know as well as I, it's hard to get guys sometimes with all the things that are going on there. And I was down. I needed 9 players, and I had like 7 or 8. Mm-hmm. And Dad, in his poor health, leans over and talks to Mom. Mom relayed the story to me, which is usually how it went when Dad had to tell you something. It went through Mom. And he said, tell Chris that I could probably catch for the team. I don't think I can hit and run, but I could probably catch. This man was not well.
Yeah.
And was wanting to make sure that I didn't miss out on what I wanted to do. So.
Yeah. And I remember, I attended your father's funeral, and our mutual friend Philip Palmer was the master of ceremonies, or delivered the eulogy and handled the deal. And I knew then that you guys had a really big family, and that love really kept you together. And just to see, especially the amount of time, as your mom just mentioned, and I'll pose this to you, Ken, your mom mentioned the kids coming back. I mean, that's a lot when he's 42 and the 8th child is about to be delivered. I mean, that's a lot. And I wonder if he tried to keep that together as much as you still got to work. He's 42. He's not anywhere close to retirement, and you've got 8 mouths to feed, and to show the love and devotion as well. I mean, that's a lot of pressure on anybody at 42.
Yeah, he definitely had to work hard. And back in those days, you didn't work from home. You commuted. He worked down at Denargo Market, which, as you know, is down by Coors Field. Yeah. So he drove into work every day. Traffic wasn't nearly as bad back then. Mm-hmm. But he worked Monday through Friday, and I don't think he'd get home till 6:30 at night. And then he had to work every other Saturday. So he was just gone a lot working, and he had to put bread on the table for our family. We never went on vacation. We would go to the South Platte River and put inner tubes in. That was vacation, But we didn't miss anything. I mean, it was a loving family. We're having fun. There's kids all over the neighborhood. So he did the best he could do with what he had, and he was a very good wage earner, and he saved his money and invested well, and he has taken care of Mom all these years, even after he's gone.
Pat, what do you think? And we have one more segment coming up. What do you think Lou would think of Our World War II Dad in this video and audio series? What would he think about it?
He would be extremely proud of his boys, of the job they have done. I know it took hours and hours to produce that podcast.
Was he a humble man in that he'd be maybe telling Chris and Ken, oh, come on, guys, I was just doing my job?
I don't think so. Uh-huh. He liked the attention. He really would like the attention. Yeah, I think he would just have loved every minute of it. Probably watched it a couple of times, too.
Probably. We'll wrap up this week's program here on the American Veteran Show with Pat and Ken and Chris Cangilla. As we remember Lou Cangilla, and he's Ken and Chris's World War II dad. We'll wrap up the program and give you a little bit of an anecdote as to if you followed us on this program talking about the late Dr. Bob McAdam and our film 25 Steps. We have these guests to thank because they introduced me many years ago. We'll wrap up the program coming up next. This is the American Veteran Show, AmericanVeteranShow.com.
Now, back to the American Veteran Show. Here's Steffan Tubbs.
Welcome back, and we wrap this edition of the American Veteran Show. Thank you so much to our guests, Chris and Ken and Pat Cangilla, as we talk about a video and audio podcast series I hope that you can take part in, and we'll give you a couple of more reminders before we wrap up in this segment, but it's called Our World War II Dad. You can follow them on Twitter. You can even send them an email, and I know, Chris, right off the bat on this final segment, I mean, that would be something really cool, not just to get the accolades, but, you know, even if you got on your email address, which is ourworldwar2dad@gmail.com. So it's, you know, the actual typing is our WWII2dad@gmail.com. It'd be really cool, whether it's tomorrow or down the road next year or whenever, that, you know, somebody watched what you and Ken have produced and, you know, they're now picking it up and doing their own thing, right?
It would be great. And we, you know, in our last episode, we put it out there to our viewers and listeners. Please, you know, tell us your story. And if you can, a moment, you know, shoot a little video talking about, you know, your World War II relative, and let us know what they were all about, because we want to do kind of a epilogue episode closer to Veterans Day, where we can really share some of those stories, because it is a kind of a community, right? And this community, as Ken has alluded to, you know, it's the greatest generation. You know, we're losing a lot of those guys and those stories. So we want to really, you know, keep that alive.
Ken, I probably asked you this in various ways, shapes, and forms over the much of this hour. But I mean, if there's one thing or two things or 10 things, but what do you think you've learned, especially going back to Europe and kind of trying as best you could to retrace your father's steps? What did you learn about him post that trip? And now as we speak, you probably maybe have one or two, maybe more episodes, but big picture, what did you learn about Lou Cangilla?
I think what I learned was the snippets that he told us were so benign. And then when I walked in his footsteps, and I had a great German guide there who had figured some things out for me and was able to take me to the exact streets where C Company of the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate had fought, and show me pictures from back in those days.
You have one, if I could interrupt you, you have a couple. And I know you know what I'm talking about. You have a couple where you have a photo from World War II and what it looks like today, and it made my hair stand on end. Talk about that.
Yeah, there's I think my favorite photo, and this is the first place that the guide took me to. My favorite photo is we pull up and he shows me this picture, black and white picture, you know, and it's this American soldier, and he's standing in this doorway. And it's like a basement doorway, and he's got his gun out, and he's looking up the street, and there's smoke, and, you know, it's a stone house, you know, it's Europe. And you look at that, and he goes, okay, look to your left, and look over there, and there's the house. It's still there. It's the same doorway. And it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And he said, this isn't just where an American soldier was. This is where C Company was. This is where your dad's troops were. This is the street your dad worked his way up under enemy machine gun fire. And it just boggles your mind when you think about standing in that same place.
Yeah. And Chris, you know, using those visuals too, I know for you being in that medium, it's just a godsend and just amazing. And then for you to do what you do professionally, but then putting this together in this podcast, that again, Our World War II Dad, that just had to be a trip for you, Chris.
It was a lot of fun. You know, Ken, this is going back even before the pandemic, found a photo, and it is the town square of Malmedy in Belgium. And there's all the Army vehicles and infantrymen in it. And he said, isn't that cool? My dad was in this town square. Like, that is cool. And so I took it upon myself to this is way before any thought of this. Mm-hmm. I went and dropped went on Google Maps and dropped myself in that same spot. I found where that spot was, and sure enough, everything was still there. Majority of the things were still there. And that really got me going into, well, I could do, a visual. You've seen these before, where it starts on the old photo and it transitions into the current day view of that same photo. And that was a big part of a lot of these things that we were able to find and use and recreate, what it looked like then and what it looks like now.
Chris, I'll ask you the same question I asked Ken moments ago, and that is, what big picture, what did you learn about your dad?
Well, that's what I've shared with Ken and our listeners is, and Ken kind of alluded to this as well, we knew Dad as Dad, this grown man, older guy, right? And when we think about it, I never really thought about how young he was. And I always watched World War II movies and shows, and those guys always, to me, seem like they're in their, late 20s at the earliest, or their 30s. They seem so much older. And now being a father and having kids that have gone through being 17, 18, these were kids, man. And they stepped up and did their job. And it's hard to think of, my kids doing it. Even I was an idiot 17-year-old, even me doing what these men did. And so that's one thing I really take away from it. And you mentioned earlier about Dad, he was the guy that did what was needed to be done. He was asked to do something and he did what was needed to be done. And I think as a father, he did the same thing. I have 8 kids. I need to work a lot so I can provide for them. I'm going to do what is needed to be done.
Pat, did you learn anything about your husband? How many years were you married?
45.
So in 45 years of marriage, your sons now, a couple decades later, they put this together. Did you learn anything?
Well, I didn't realize how dangerous his life had been as a young man. And I told the story on the podcast that I had to take a child into the bathroom during the night because it was having a nightmare. And I always took them in and wiped their face down with a warm washcloth. Well, my husband was in the bathroom taking a shower at the time. So I went in and I didn't want the child to wake up, so I turned the light out and he immediately dropped down. And I thought, wow. And he said to me, that's what I learned in the Army. Make yourself small. Yeah.
Our World War II Dad. In the moments that we have left, and Chris, I'll give you the opportunity again to direct people to go watch and or listen to this. Take me back, and I'm getting older now. This just in. How did you introduce me to one Dr. Robert McAdam of 25 Steps fame?
I'm not sure exactly how that came about, and we'll just kind of give a little background. Our oldest sister, Mom's firstborn, is Claudia, and she's married to Gary McAdam, and Dr. Bob McAdam is Gary's dad, his World War II dad, if you will.
Yeah.
And he had incredible stories, and I think you were getting so involved. I know how you have, served the veterans. Well, I don't know if you want to say served, but you have recognized what the veterans have done over your career. And I think it just naturally led to talking to Dr. McAdam about his experience.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like, hey, I got a guy you should meet. Yeah. And I mean, you want to talk about an amazing story. Again, the basis for 25 Steps was, see, Cangillas, I owe you that. If it weren't for Claudia marrying Gary, I would have never known, to Chris's point, Gary's World War II dad in the amazing Bob McAdam. Chris, I want to give you a kind of final comment and again, guide everybody to how they can hear and watch Our World War II Dad.
Absolutely. And we thank you so much for having us on your show. Our World War II Dad, and it's World War II is WW and 2 I's for the 2. Our World War II Dad can be found on YouTube as a visual podcast. And then it's also as an audio podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. But gosh, you really need to look at the visuals and see that YouTube podcast. But my last thought is, this project was I was kind of selfish. I wanted to learn what Ken learned when he went and saw where Dad was. And boy, did I ever. And I had a great connection with my brother, with my mom. We talked with the other brothers and sisters about this thing. So it really was something that our family is very proud of. And like we talked about at the beginning, it is a true American story, and I think people will really like watching it.
Yeah, Chris, thank you. I love you, brother. And you know, the way you put it, Ken, Chris alluded to, you know, it's an American story. It's fascinating to us. Maybe, well, first it's your blood relative, it's your dad, but then the other part is so many of these stories have gone to the graves, and nobody did what you guys have done. Did you learn anything about yourself? I know that's kind of a corny question, but did you?
Yeah, I think I think I learned that. I think I gained more of an appreciation for what Dad went through, and I think what I learned and that I pass on to younger listeners is, don't wait. Talk to your parents, your grandparents, whoever you've got in your life. They all have interesting stories to tell.
Everyone, yeah.
Sit down and talk to them. And Chris always reminds me, don't just talk to them, record it. And so we're so lucky to have Chris in our family to be able to capture all of this information for us. So, you know, that was a defining moment for me, was to just get the information and make it available for everybody to see from here on out.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I'll give you the final word. As you look back, I think I know the answer, and that would be, you're glad that your boys kind of were a little bit curious and got into this a little bit more than maybe, you know, you thought they would have 10 years ago.
Oh, yes. My son Lou had gone over to Europe before Ken did, but he didn't go into the war part of it. He looked at the history of my husband's family that was sent there in Italy and then came over to the United States. And so it was a different story that he came home with than what Ken told us. Mm-hmm. But they were both interesting.
Glad that they did it, right?
Oh, yes, always.
It is so great to see you. Thank you for being so kind to me for almost 30 years, and it's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Steffan.
Ken, my brother, thank you. Thank you. And I don't know, Chris,
you
too, and congratulations. Chris, I love you. I owe you. You've given me a lot over nearly 3 decades of friendship, and I hold that close to my heart. Thank you, brother.
Well, you've given me a lot too, my brother, so I appreciate it, and you are part of this family, so, you know, we'll let you, call our dad, your World War II dad, a little bit too, if you want.
That is actually, you got me. You got me. Chris and Ken and Pat Cangilla, and this we dedicate to the memory of Lou Cangilla, our World War II dad. You can find them on YouTube and Spotify and Apple iTunes as well. That wraps up this week's edition. Hope you've enjoyed it. Again, reach out, or at minimum, give you a to-do list. Record your family's history. You will thank yourself later. For our producer, Michael Arpaio, I'm Steffan Tubbs. Have a great week ahead, and remember our troops.